Something didn't add up. Caitlin Clark wasn't supposed to be in Miami. Not yet. Team USA camp doesn't start for another 2 weeks. The off-season grind was supposed to be winding down. Players were expected to rest, reset, maybe post a few vacation photos, and disappear until training officially began. Instead, leaked footage surfaces. Aaliyah Boston's Instagram story. A quick glimpse. Caitlin Clark. In Miami. Relaxed. Smiling. Standing alongside teammates. And then the internet exploded. Because this wasn't just a random beach sighting. This wasn't just players hanging out. The timing was too precise. The names involved were too important. And the silence around it? Even louder. Why would the biggest star in women's basketball fly to Miami weeks before she needed to be there? Why were multiple Indiana Fever players gathering at the same time? And why was Sophie Cunningham reportedly spotted in the mix? That's when speculation turned into something bigger. Because when franchise players move early, it's rarely accidental. The Fever are heading into one of the most delicate off-seasons in recent memory. Expansion draft pressure. Free agency uncertainty. Super team rumors swirling around the league. MVP politics heating up. Contracts coming due. And suddenly, the core of the team is assembling in private. No press release. No announcement. Just social media breadcrumbs. Some fans say it's nothing. Others say it's leadership. But a growing number believe something strategic is happening behind the scenes. Because when Caitlin Clark moves, the league feels it. And this might not be a vacation at all. This might be the first move in a much bigger chess match. But to understand why Miami matters, you have to look at the timing. And the timing is where things get interesting. 2 weeks early. That's what makes this strange. Team USA camp had a clear schedule. Players knew when they were expected to report. There was no emergency meeting. No publicized early workouts. No official reason for Clark to be in Miami ahead of schedule. And yet, there she was. If this were any other player, maybe it wouldn't spark headlines. But this is Caitlin Clark. Every move she makes generates conversation. Every appearance shifts the narrative. So when she arrives early, people start asking questions. Was she just getting extra reps in? Possibly. Was she bonding with teammates before the intensity ramps up? Maybe. But here's the part that doesn't sit right with many observers. It wasn't just her. Aaliyah Boston was there. Other Fever connections surfaced. And when Sophie Cunningham's name started circulating in connection with Miami, that's when eyebrows really went up. Because now this isn't just preseason preparation. Now this looks coordinated. And coordination before an expansion draft? That matters. Coordination before free agency chaos? That matters even more. Let's talk about what the Fever are facing. The expansion draft is looming like a storm cloud. Teams will be forced to protect a limited number of players. Someone valuable will be exposed. That's the harsh reality. And when players know tough decisions are coming, they talk. They align. They strategize. It wouldn't be shocking if the core group wanted clarity before management makes those calls. But there's another layer here. Leadership. Last season, Clark walked into the WNBA as the most hyped rookie in league history. Cameras everywhere. Pressure everywhere. Critics waiting. Veterans watching. She handled it. But it wasn't smooth. There were growing pains. Media narratives. Physical play. Internal adjustments. Now, she's not just the rookie. She's the centerpiece. Arriving early signals something subtle but powerful. It says, I'm not waiting for the season to start. It says, I'm building this now. It says, I'm taking control of what happens next. And when franchise players take control, it shifts locker room dynamics. Some will love it. Some might feel threatened. But no one ignores it. There's also the conditioning angle. Clark has been vocal about wanting to elevate her physical readiness. The WNBA schedule is brutal. Injuries last season exposed depth issues for Indiana. The team leaned heavily on chemistry to survive. That chemistry, often joked about as the power of friendship, was real. They played for each other. They fought through injuries together. It kept them competitive. But chemistry alone doesn't win championships. And maybe Clark knows that. Maybe Miami wasn't about bonding. Maybe it was about recalibrating. Because let's be honest, running it back with the exact same roster might not be enough. The league is evolving fast. Free agents are circling. Super team whispers are growing louder. Other franchises are preparing aggressive moves. If Indiana waits, they risk falling behind. So what if Miami wasn't optional? What if it was urgent? There's also something else worth noting. When star players arrive early, they often bring influence with them. Informal conversations turn into alignment. Alignment turns into expectations. Expectations turn into pressure on front offices. Was this simply about working out? Or was it about sending a message to management? We're serious. We're together. Protect the core. Make the right moves. Because if you zoom out, this offseason is bigger than Miami. It's about identity. Is Indiana building around Clark as a long-term franchise pillar? Or are they still experimenting? Arriving early forces that question. And if Sophie Cunningham was indeed part of that Miami gathering, that adds fuel to another theory. Sophie isn't just a role player. She brings edge, toughness, emotional spark. She protects her teammates. She thrives in physical games. That kind of presence next to Clark isn't accidental. It's protective. And protection matters when your star is the most targeted player in the league. So maybe Miami wasn't about sunshine. Maybe it was about security. Maybe it was about drawing lines before the season even begins. And here's the uncomfortable part. When players gather privately before official camp, it sometimes means they don't fully trust how things will unfold publicly. They want unity before uncertainty hits. They want clarity before chaos starts. They want to lock in the inner circle before outside noise gets loud again. Because once Team USA camp begins, media narratives explode. Every practice becomes a headline. Every scrimmage becomes debate fuel. Every interaction gets analyzed. Miami was quiet, controlled, intentional, and the timing suggests one thing above all. This wasn't random. But the real pressure isn't just about early workouts or chemistry sessions. It's about who might not be there when the dust settles. And once you look at the expansion draft math, that's when this story stops feeling casual and starts feeling strategic. Here's the part fans don't like thinking about. Someone is getting left behind. That's the brutal math of an expansion draft. When a new franchise enters the league, existing teams don't get to protect everyone. They choose a limited number of players. The rest become vulnerable, exposed, available. And for Indiana, that decision won't be easy. Because this isn't just about talent. It's about loyalty. It's about chemistry. It's about protecting the right future. And that's exactly why Miami matters. When core players gather before major roster decisions are finalized, it suggests one thing: alignment. They're not just bonding. They're preparing. Let's break down the reality. Caitlin Clark, untouchable. Aaliyah Boston, untouchable. Those two are the foundation. But once you move beyond the obvious names, things get complicated fast. Sophie Cunningham, Lexi Hull, bench depth pieces. Role players who may not dominate stat sheets, but are critical emotionally and strategically. The front office has to ask uncomfortable questions. Who is essential long-term? Who is replaceable? Who fits the Clark timeline? And that last question might be the most important. Because make no mistake, the Fever are now on Caitlin Clark's clock. The league revolves around her spotlight. Ticket sales spike when she plays. National broadcasts increase. The franchise value rises. That kind of gravitational pull changes everything. Front offices don't just build teams anymore. They build ecosystems around stars. So when Clark shows up early in Miami, surrounded by key teammates, the subtext is powerful. This is my core. Are you keeping it? Sophie Cunningham becomes extremely interesting in this context. Statistically, she's not the centerpiece. But emotionally, she's an enforcer, a tone setter, a player who doesn't back down when games get physical. Last season, Clark took hits. Hard hits. Defensive pressure that crossed lines. Veteran physicality that tested her endurance. Who stood firm in those moments. Who made opponents think twice. That matters in roster construction. And in an expansion draft, teams don't just evaluate points per game. They evaluate value. Intangibles. Edge. Protection. Locker room temperature. There's also the contract layer. Rookie deals. Minimums. Free agency timing. Cap flexibility. Some players are easier to expose because the math makes sense. Others are harder to lose because replacing their role costs more than their salary suggests. If Sophie isn't protected, another franchise could scoop her instantly. If Lexi is left available, does another team gamble on her upside? If depth pieces go, does the chemistry fracture? And here's the uncomfortable reality. Sometimes front offices gamble that emotional chemistry can be rebuilt. Sometimes they assume talent is replaceable. But what if that's wrong? Last season, Indiana survived injuries not because they had the most stacked roster, but because they had unity. They played for each other. They fought for each other. They believed. That doesn't show up in analytics sheets. That doesn't translate into cap spreadsheets. But it wins games you shouldn't win. So when the Fever core quietly gathers in Miami before expansion decisions are finalized, it feels less like coincidence and more like consolidation. It feels like a silent meeting of the protected circle. And let's push this one step further. What if Clark's influence is already stronger than people realize? Superstars don't always publicly demand roster moves, but their presence shapes direction. If Clark builds strong relationships internally, management notices. If she thrives with certain players, that matters. If she feels protected with certain teammates on the floor, that matters even more. Front offices invest where their franchise player is most comfortable. And Miami could have been about solidifying that comfort. Now imagine you're the Fever front office. You know a super team could form elsewhere this offseason. You know free agents are watching. You know Clark's window is opening fast. Do you risk losing key emotional glue pieces in an expansion draft? Or do you sacrifice depth elsewhere to protect the inner circle? That's the tension. And that tension makes Miami feel strategic. Because expansion drafts aren't just transactional. They're emotional fractures waiting to happen. Players talk. They speculate. They wonder if their name is on the unprotected list. That uncertainty can quietly poison a locker room. Unless leadership intervenes early. Unless alignment happens before panic sets in. Clark arriving 2 weeks early suggests urgency. It suggests she doesn't want the offseason drifting aimlessly. It suggests she understands the stakes. There's another layer here that few are discussing. What if the Miami gathering was also about clarity? What if players wanted to know where they stand before rumors start spiraling publicly? Expansion drafts create insecurity. Free agency creates anxiety. Super team rumors create fear. And fear spreads fast. The smartest teams get ahead of it. They communicate. They unify. They decide internally before the league forces decisions externally. If that's what Miami was, then this wasn't just preparation. It was protection. But here's where things get even more complicated. Protecting Sophie might mean exposing someone else valuable. Keeping chemistry might cost flexibility. Saving loyalty might sacrifice upgrade potential. And that leads to the next uncomfortable conversation. Because even if Indiana keeps its core intact, even if no major pieces are lost, even if Clark, Boston, Sophie, and the key contributors stay together, is it enough? That question is getting louder, and it's about to collide with something much bigger. Because while Indiana is trying to protect what they've built, the rest of the league might be building something far more dangerous. And that's where the super team whispers begin. Here's what makes this offseason different. It's not just about the Fever. It's about everyone. The WNBA is quietly heading toward one of the most volatile free agency periods in recent memory. Contracts are expiring. Rookie deals are maturing. Veterans are weighing legacy versus leverage. And front offices across the league are preparing for something dramatic. A super team. Not a small upgrade. Not a minor trade. A full-scale power consolidation. And if that happens, it changes everything. Because once one franchise loads up, everyone else has to react immediately. Now suddenly Miami doesn't look like a vacation. It looks like positioning. Let's talk about the whispers. Dallas. That's the city that keeps surfacing in conversations. Not confirmed. Not official. Just a growing murmur across fan circles and insiders. The idea of a UConn reunion. The possibility of elite players aligning under one roof. The kind of move that shifts the balance of the entire league overnight. Is it guaranteed? No. Is it possible? Absolutely. And here's why that matters for Indiana. Caitlin Clark isn't just competing for playoff spots. She's competing for relevance in a rapidly escalating arms race. If a super team forms elsewhere, the Fever cannot afford to stand still. Running it back becomes dangerous. Loyalty becomes expensive. And chemistry alone won't survive a loaded roster across the conference. So ask yourself this. If you're Clark, watching the league landscape shift in real time, do you wait or do you act early? Miami suggests she's not waiting. Because super teams don't just happen in July. They begin in February. In quiet meetups. In private conversations. In subtle alignments. Players don't publicly announce recruitment. But stars talk. They float ideas. They test interest. They gauge loyalty. And sometimes they gather before the headlines start. Now here's where this gets even more interesting. What if Miami wasn't just about protecting the current roster? What if it was about strengthening it? Because while fans are focused on who might leave in the expansion draft, very few are asking who might be joining. Free agents notice momentum. They notice unity. They notice early commitment. If Clark and the Fever core are visibly locked in before the offseason chaos begins, that sends a signal. We're stable. We're serious. We're building. And free agents gravitate toward clarity. Let's not ignore the Clark factor here. She's not just another player entering her second season. She's a brand. She's national attention. She's broadcast leverage. Players understand that playing next to her elevates exposure instantly. More televised games. More sponsorship eyes. More spotlight. That's powerful currency. So when Clark shows up early, visibly aligned with teammates, it could also be interpreted as a message to the league. If you want in, this is the foundation. But the super team fear runs deeper than just Dallas rumors. It's structural. The WNBA is evolving financially. Media deals are expanding. Visibility is increasing. And when money rises, consolidation happens. Stars don't always spread out evenly. They cluster. They chase rings. They protect legacies. And that creates imbalance fast. If Indiana doesn't prepare for that shift, they risk becoming competitive but not dominant. Dangerous but not feared. Exciting but not inevitable. Clark's arrival changed expectations. Now the bar isn't just make the playoffs. It's contend. It's control. It's build something sustainable before others overpower you. So Miami starts to feel like a defensive maneuver. A preemptive strike against instability. Because imagine this scenario. A super team forms elsewhere. Indiana loses a valuable piece in the expansion draft. Free agents hesitate. Suddenly the Fever are chasing instead of dictating. That's the nightmare. And stars don't like chasing. They like steering. There's another subtle angle here. Leadership vacuum. When leagues shift, young stars either grow into vocal anchors or they get swallowed by louder veterans elsewhere. Clark arriving early suggests growth. It suggests ownership. It suggests she understands that waiting for management to solve everything might not be enough. Great players don't just play. They influence. They attract. They stabilize. Miami could have been a moment of stabilization. Because when uncertainty hits, silence is dangerous. Unity isn't. Now let's talk about Sophie Cunningham in this context. If the league is preparing for physical, high-stakes, star-loaded matchups, you need players who thrive in chaos. Sophie brings edge. She brings confrontation when necessary. She brings toughness in playoff-level intensity. In a league trending toward consolidation and aggression, that archetype becomes more valuable. So if Clark sees a super team threat forming, she might also see the need to fortify internally. And fortifying doesn't always mean adding a superstar. Sometimes it means doubling down on protectors. But here's where the tension peaks. What if the Fever's internal bond, the chemistry everyone praises, becomes a trap? Because when you love your core, it's harder to make ruthless upgrades. When friendships are strong, hard cuts hurt more. When loyalty runs deep, cold business decisions feel colder. Super teams don't operate emotionally. They operate strategically. And if Indiana wants to compete in that environment, sentimentality can't override reality. That's the crossroads Miami hints at. Are they gathering to protect what they built? Or to prepare for what they must become? Because if a super team wave hits the league, only two types of franchises survive it. The ones who build one, or the ones who are ready for one. And Caitlin Clark showing up early, ahead of schedule, ahead of narrative, ahead of pressure, feels like someone who understands that storm is coming. But even if Indiana avoids losing key pieces, even if they strengthen internally, there's still a hard truth looming. Because unity and preparation don't automatically equal championships. And that brings us to the uncomfortable debate no one wants to say too loudly. Is this roster actually good enough? That's where things get complicated. And that's where Section 4 changes the tone entirely. Here's the truth no one likes saying out loud. The Fever were lovable last season. They were gritty. They were unified. They were resilient through injuries, chaos, media storms, and pressure that would have cracked most young rosters. But lovable doesn't automatically mean championship ready. And that's the tension building under the surface. Yes, the power of friendship narrative became almost a meme. but it was real. That team genuinely fought for each other. When injuries piled up, when rotations shifted, when Clark was being targeted nightly, they didn't splinter. They tightened. That matters. But championships demand more than unity. They demand upgrades. And this is where Miami starts to feel less like bonding and more like evaluation. Because if you look at the Fever objectively, there are clear questions. The power forward position remains unsettled. Bench production has been inconsistent. Scoring depth fluctuates. There were games last season where Clark carried the offensive load to unsustainable levels. And as the league adjusts to her tendencies, that burden will only increase. Opponents now have film. They have schemes. They know how to pressure her full court. They know how to attack passing lanes. They know how to test her physically. So running it back without meaningful upgrades could be dangerous. Chemistry can carry you through adversity, but raw talent wins playoff series. And here's the part that complicates everything. If you upgrade, someone beloved might have to go. That's the cold edge of professional sports. Maybe it's a rotation player. Maybe it's a locker room favorite. Maybe it's someone who played a crucial emotional role last season. But improvement isn't sentimental. It's strategic. And if a super team forms elsewhere, Indiana cannot afford emotional paralysis. Now ask yourself this. Would Clark be satisfied with incremental improvement? Or does she want dominance? She's wired competitively. That's obvious. The way she reacts to defensive pressure. The way she demands the ball late. The way she doesn't shy away from big moments. Players like that don't just want to compete. They want control. They want to dictate the league's direction. And if that's the internal standard, then good enough won't hold for long. That's where the front office pressure intensifies. Protecting Sophie in an expansion draft makes emotional sense. But if there's a chance to acquire a higher ceiling forward, that decision becomes harder. Keeping depth players preserves continuity. But if a star becomes available in free agency, continuity can become an obstacle. Miami could have been about confronting this reality early. Because if the core players are aligned on ambition, if they all understand that comfort must be sacrificed for growth, then tough moves become easier. But if there's division, if some players feel secure while others sense vulnerability, that tension fractures silently. And fractures don't show up until playoff pressure exposes them. There's also the Clark MVP factor quietly shaping expectations. She's already being discussed as a favorite. Think about that. Second season, already in MVP conversations. That kind of projection changes team psychology. Because if your franchise player is ascending that quickly, the roster must rise with her. Otherwise, the narrative shifts from Clark elevates the fever to Clark carries the fever. And carrying rarely leads to rings. Look around the league historically. True contenders have balance. Elite guard play plus frontcourt strength. Reliable bench scoring. Defensive anchors. Indiana showed flashes. But flashes aren't sustained dominance. Now layer in fatigue. The WNBA schedule is relentless. Travel demands are real. Injuries aren't hypothetical, they're inevitable. If Indiana doesn't improve depth meaningfully, they risk overloading Clark again. And that's dangerous long-term. So Miami begins to look like a checkpoint. A moment where players could privately acknowledge. Last year was growth. This year must be aggression. And aggression requires sacrifice. Let's talk specifically about the power forward situation. Natasha Howard has been solid, experienced, reliable. But is she the long-term answer next to Clark in Boston? Or is there room for a more dynamic stretch presence? A forward who can space the floor wider? Who can switch defensively across multiple positions? Those marginal upgrades win playoff games. And if the Fever don't pursue that tier of player, they risk plateauing. Plateaus are dangerous for rising stars. Because when a franchise feels stuck, superstars start wondering. Not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. They evaluate. They assess trajectory. And trajectory matters more than friendship. This is why the expansion draft and free agency conversations can't be separated from Miami. If Clark and the core gathered early, maybe it wasn't just about solidarity. Maybe it was about ambition. About making sure everyone is on the same page before management makes irreversible decisions. Because the worst scenario for Indiana isn't losing a role player. It's losing momentum. Momentum is fragile. Right now, the Fever are one of the most talked about teams in basketball. But attention fades fast if wins don't follow hype. And hype without growth becomes pressure. That's the balancing act. Maintain chemistry. Add firepower, avoid fracture, and elevate ceiling. The league isn't waiting. Super team rumors are accelerating. Free agents are calculating. And the MVP spotlight is intensifying around Clark, which means the margin for hesitation is shrinking. Miami might have been the first sign that the Fever understand that. But just when you think this is purely about roster math and upgrades, another layer complicates everything. Because as Clark's power rises, so does the league politics around her. And that's where things get even more explosive. Here's where things get uncomfortable for the rest of the league. Caitlin Clark isn't just popular anymore. She's powerful. There's a difference. Popularity sells tickets. Power changes dynamics. And right now, Clark is entering her second season with MVP conversations already forming around her name. Think about how rare that is. Rookies are supposed to adjust. Second-year players are supposed to grow quietly. Clark, she's being projected as a potential face of the league. That kind of acceleration doesn't happen without friction. Because when one star rises this quickly, others feel it. Veterans notice it. Media narratives amplify it. Award discussions intensify. And suddenly every performance carries political weight. The MVP debate alone is already layered. There are established stars who've been grinding for years. Players who've consistently put up numbers. Veterans who've carried franchises without the spotlight Clark receives. So if Clark surges into that award race early, some will celebrate it. Others will question it. And that tension spills into locker rooms, front offices, and even off-season dynamics. This is where Miami becomes more than just strategy. It becomes insulation. Because when outside pressure grows, internal unity becomes critical. If Clark is stepping into MVP territory, the Fever must solidify around her. Not just talent-wise. Emotionally, public scrutiny will intensify. Every loss will be dissected. Every stat line will be compared. Every highlight will be debated. If the team fractures under that pressure, it becomes a distraction. But if they're aligned, it becomes fuel. Now consider this. When a player's brand grows rapidly, so does her leverage. Not in an arrogant way. In a structural way. Networks want her games. Sponsors want her image. Fans travel to see her. Front offices understand that. And that reality changes how decisions are made. Clark might not walk into meetings demanding roster changes. But her presence alone shapes direction. If she thrives with certain players, they become valuable assets. If she builds chemistry early, like showing up in Miami before anyone else, that chemistry becomes harder to break apart. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly. And that's what this off-season feels like. A quiet recalibration of influence. There's also the unrivaled narrative floating in the background. Comparisons. Performance debates. Award politics. Some fans argue certain players are being overhyped. Others feel established names are being overlooked. These conversations may seem separate from Miami, but they're not. Because perception matters. If Clark's narrative continues to grow, if she's consistently framed as the future MVP, the franchise centerpiece, the rising icon, that shapes how teammates align. Some players thrive next to that spotlight. Others struggle in its shadow, which makes Miami even more strategic. If the core group is unified early, it prevents jealousy from festering. It prevents narrative fractures from creeping in. It reinforces identity before outside voices try to redefine it. Now here's the subtle but critical shift. Last season, Clark entered the league as the new star. This season, she enters as a gravitational force. That changes expectations. It changes how referees officiate her. It changes how opponents guard her. It changes how executives think about marketability. And most importantly, it changes how her own team positions itself around her. If she's truly entering MVP territory, Indiana can't behave like a rebuilding team anymore. They have to operate like contenders. And contenders don't move casually. They move intentionally. Miami was intentional. Now let's connect this back to Sophie Cunningham for a moment. In high-pressure MVP races, physicality increases. Scrutiny increases. Emotions increase. You need players who embrace chaos, not shrink from it. Sophie's presence in Miami, whether officially confirmed or heavily speculated, fits that archetype. She's not just a role player. She's energy. She's confrontation when necessary. She's emotional reinforcement. And when your franchise star is stepping into MVP-level spotlight, that kind of support becomes invaluable. But power shifts aren't always smooth. As Clark's influence grows, expectations skyrocket. If the Fever underperform, criticism won't target depth pieces. It will target her. If the roster isn't upgraded, pressure intensifies. If a super team forms elsewhere and dominates, the narrative becomes brutal. Why didn't Indiana prepare? That's why Miami feels preemptive. Because the worst position for a rising star is reactive leadership. Great franchises anticipate. They don't scramble. And Clark arriving early, before camp, before headlines, before formal announcements, feels like anticipation. Now let's zoom out one final time. Expansion draft pressure. Free agency volatility. Super team rumors. MVP politics. Brand growth. Chemistry versus upgrades. All of these threads converge in one moment. A simple Instagram story. A quiet Miami gathering. What looked like casual off-season footage might actually represent the first move in a much larger recalibration. Because here's the reality. The Fever are no longer just developing. They're being evaluated as a future power. And Caitlin Clark is no longer just adjusting. She's ascending. The league feels it. Opponents feel it. Executives feel it. And maybe Miami was about making sure her own locker room feels it too. So let's call it what it is. Caitlin Clark showing up in Miami 2 weeks early wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. And it definitely wasn't meaningless. It was a signal. A signal that the Fever understand the stakes. A signal that alignment matters before chaos hits. A signal that the franchise centerpiece isn't waiting around for direction. Expansion draft decisions are coming. Free agency turbulence is coming. Super team rumors are gaining momentum. MVP conversations are accelerating. And in the middle of all of it stands Caitlin Clark, not just as a scorer, not just as a highlight machine, but as a central force in the league's shifting balance. Miami may have been quiet, but quiet moves often precede loud seasons. And if this gathering truly was strategic, if it was about protecting chemistry, preparing for upgrades, and insulating against outside pressure, then what we're watching isn't just off-season bonding. We're watching the early stages of something calculated, something intentional, something that could define the next era of the WNBA. The real question isn't why she was in Miami. The real question is what happens next. Because if this was the first move, the second move could change everything. If you want the breakdowns the mainstream media won't connect. If you want the deeper chess moves behind the headlines. And if you want to stay ahead of every roster shift, super team rumor, and MVP battle before it explodes, make sure you subscribe right now. Because this off-season is just getting started. And what's coming next might be bigger than anyone expects.